While the world continues to hold its breath as we await the news, what will President Obama and the Western powers decide to do? Now, let me make sure that all of you are up to date on what's really going on here. Let's go back to the beginning to see if we can't have some clarity of understanding. We know that the Arab Spring swept through, first of all, Tunisia, then Yemen, then Egypt, then Libya, then Syria. So the dominoes were falling. Mubarak was toppled. The dictator of Yemen was toppled. Muammar Gaddafi was gone. And it just looked like a revolution very similar to the Velvet Revolution that swept through Europe back in 1988, 1989. But when it got to Syria, all of a sudden, Bashar Assad dug his heels in and began to fight. He immediately accused external forces of importing the revolution to his country. Now, all of us wondered, what's this Arab Spring all about? Is this just springing out of nothing? Is this really a populist revolution that's coming from the people? Or is there someone somewhere pulling the strings? Where's this funding come from? How do 1 million people suddenly show up in the street? Is that all spontaneous, or is it orchestrated? I mean, those are questions, legitimate questions that come to our mind. Well, when the Arab Spring, when the demonstrations began in Syria, Bashar Assad attempted to mollify and to put down these things, but it wasn't long until the bullets began to fly. And then there were 20,000 dead, and then 30,000, and then 40,000, and then 50,000. Well, immediately President Obama rushed to the UN Security Council, as he had done in Libya, and he proposed a resolution for a no-fly zone over Syria to punish Bashar al-Assad and ultimately to bring him to an abdication of power. President Obama called for the overthrow of President Assad. However, Assad continued to fight. Now, I knew a little bit about this history from years ago. Bashar Assad's father, Hafez Assad, faced just such a revolution way back, maybe 30 years ago or so. And ultimately, I think 25 to 30,000 were killed. And Hafez Assad put down his opponents brutally. So I wasn't surprised when Bashar al-Assad began to really lower the hammer, because undoubtedly he was drawing a page from his father's history book about how do you deal with these kinds of situations. Now, Assad claimed that this really was a minority of his people rising up against the government, and that the majority of the Syrian people still wanted him to be their leader. He determined he was not going to allow a vocal and violent minority to alter the government. He even promised to hold new elections in 2014 if everyone would just go home, behave, and let the thing be done with the ballot box rather than by the bullets. Well, that didn't work, and the casualties continue to mount. We go up to 60,000, 70,000, 80,000, 90,000, and finally it topped 100,000, with President Obama continuing to call for the fall of Bashar Assad. However, the reason that the UN Security Council resolutions was not working was because Russia and China exercised their veto power at the UN. Now, let's pause a moment for a little bit of perspective here. Many people believe that there's a fatal flaw in the structure of the UN. When the UN was formed back in 1945, the concept was that we would have a democracy of nations, that the nations of the world would belong to this world government organization, and when there was a conflict among the nations, they would bring their cause to the world government body. It would be duly debated there. each nation would have its own ambassador to the UN, its spokesperson. And after due debate, then a vote would be held among the United Nations, and the majority would rule, and thus disputes in the nations would be settled at the ballot box instead of by means of the bullet box. So that was the concept of this whole thing. However, when the United Nations was formed in 1945, there were heads in the U.S. government that said, wait a minute, this would spell the end of U.S. sovereignty. This would place us under the control of a world governmental system. We are not willing to renounce the Declaration of Independence for a new Declaration of Interdependence, and therefore, realizing that the United Nations was soon going to be stillborn, the people at the United Nations decided to make a compromise. They decided that they would give the 5 victor powers of World War II veto power on the UN Security Council where the decisions of war and peace were made. So that's what happened. The United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and China, back in those days it was the Soviet Union, today Russia, and China, they became the 5 powers with veto power. They're called the Big Five. Now, the other 10 members of the UN Security Council do not have veto power, and they are not permanent members. The Big Five, they're permanent members, but the other 10, they're rotating members. So this is the way decisions are made. It's made by a majority vote at the UN Security Council. I think it takes a 2/3 majority to pass any resolution. However, any of the Big Five, if they vote no, it kills the resolution. They have absolute veto power over what happens there. Well, there have been many people complaining for a long time saying the day for the veto power is over. We need to repeal the veto power. And there has been proposal after proposal after proposal to abolish the veto power. However, the Big Five have always had veto power over abolishing the veto power. Consequently, they've always said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to surrender our privileged position in the world government structure. Well, here we are again. It looks like the UN is paralyzed. Now, this happened back in Kosovo. What was that, 1998, 1999, when Bill Clinton finally took NATO and went in without approval of the UN Security Council. The same thing happened in Iraq in 2003 with George Bush. He could not get a resolution through the UN Security Council, so he just did it anyway, ignoring the UN Security Council. However, things are changing. The power of world government is becoming more accepted. The propaganda drums have beaten away, and droned into our psyche that there should be international law, and that international law is really law, that it must be respected. Now, you didn't vote on international law, and I didn't vote on international law, but slowly but surely, the authors of world government have woven this tapestry of international law, and little by little, like a spider's web, it has woven itself around us until the constrictures have become tighter and tighter and tighter. Okay, well, here we are again. Now then, Russia and China are vetoing what appears to be a case of a brutal dictator killing 100,000 of his people. Now, it's not that simple, because Assad says, wait a minute, this whole thing is created by Al-Qaeda coming in from foreign powers, from the Sunni Islamists flocking to Syria to fight against the regime of the Shia regime of Bashar al-Assad. And so we're seeing a conflict between Sunni and Shia. We're seeing a conflict between Al-Qaeda and other forces, all trying to take over. We're talking about Islamist forces that would like to turn Syria into a Sharia state. And in the meantime, the outsiders are saying, well, which is worse for us? The devil we know or the devil we don't know? Some people actually, even in Israel, wonder if Israel would not be better off with Assad in power. Because if the Islamists take power, you have Sharia law. Before long, you have a revolution at your doorstep. I mean, after all, there's been relative calm between Syria and Israel, ever since the 1973 war. So, it's one of the quietest borders that Israel has. So there's a lot of people that are not even sure they want to see the regime of Bashar al-Assad overthrown. Yet, on the other hand, they also know that Assad is aligned with Iran. He was actually forced to be aligned with Iran because Iran's the only one that would stand with him. So Assad is aligned with Russia, with Iran, with Hezbollah, with Iraq. And this is the entity that continually is determined to ultimately drive Israel into the sea. So it's very complex situation. Well, finally, President Obama said that if chemical weapons were used, that would be a red line. But at the same time, we would have moved against Assad already if it were not for Russia. But Russia, every time we moved our Patriot missiles to the borders of Syria, Russia moved her superior Iskander missiles facing our Patriot missiles. And whenever we moved our battleships in, Russia moved more battleships in. And so up to this point, Russia has backed us down, and Russia has matched us rocket for rocket, missile for missile, as the battle has waged on between Assad and his enemies. Now, there's another factor here, and that is that this appears to be a totally domestic situation. Syria has not yet struck at any of the nations surrounding her. It is a domestic war, a civil war between Bashar Assad and his enemies. But now the international community is saying, but don't we have a responsibility to protect the people against this brutal dictator? After all, 100,000 dead. Now, Assad's reply is, well, there wouldn't be any dead if it wasn't for outside funding and nations like the United States and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar that have poured money in there attempting to overthrow the rule of Bashar al-Assad. So this is a real battle for control of the oil-rich Middle East. That's what's going on here right now. So, but it also boils down to, will we ever reach a time where veto power will be removed from the UN Security Council so that the UN can be a bona fide world government? Now, that's probably going to happen before it's over with. But this situation, this standoff, is certainly contributing to the groundswell to get rid of the veto power so that the UN can become a bona fide world government. It's not going to be good if that happens, but nevertheless, that's where events seem to be leading us at this particular time. We'll be right back.